Some trucks are born tough. Others are built so tough they outlive their owners, their grandkids, and probably half the neighborhood. These aren't flashy toys or weekend warriors. They're the kind of machines that keep running long after logic says they should have died. So what happens when you put durability before style, before comfort, before everything? You get legends. Buckle up, because the pickups you're about to see don't just last. They refuse to quit. Chevrolet K. 1973 to 1987. Here's the truck that became the standard by which every backyard mechanic and farm owner still measures durability. The Chevy K10 square body. If you drove through rural America in the 80s or 90s, you couldn't go a mile without seeing one, covered in mud, loaded with hay, or hauling equipment that weighed more than the truck itself. And guess what? Decades later, many of them are still at it. The K10's magic came from its bones. That square body frame was strong enough to take years of abuse, while the independent front suspension with torsion bars kept things simple and serviceable. The real star, though, was the small block 350 V8. It wasn't exotic. It wasn't complicated. It was just the greatest forever engine ever built. Reliable, easy to rebuild, and supported by an aftermarket so big you can practically order a whole new K10 piece by piece today. Owners loved how easy these trucks were to work on. The engine bay was so roomy you could climb inside with a wrench and spend an afternoon tinkering without fancy tools. Everything was mechanical. No computer chips waiting to fail. The transfer cases, axles, even the manual hubs, all designed to last decades if you kept up with basic care. And here's the kicker. The K10 wasn't just tough, it was everywhere. Construction sites, oil fields, farms, you name it. It became an American icon because it was affordable, fixable, and basically immortal. If you ask any old-school truck fan what they'd trust to get them home from the middle of nowhere, more often than not, they'll say 3 letters: K10, Ford F-250, Highboy 1967 to 1977. The Ford Highboy wasn't just tall, it was legendary. Its stance came from a heavy-duty 4-wheel drive setup, giving it serious off-road presence. But the real reason it lasted was Ford's obsession with overbuilding. Frames, axles, and transfer cases were all industrial strength. Under the hood, you had big blocks like the 360, 390, and 460 V8s. These weren't performance engines. They were torque monsters with blocks so thick they could be rebuilt multiple times. Pair them with the C6 automatic or NP435 manual, and you had drivetrains that could handle anything. Owners loved that these trucks were no nonsense. Manual locking hubs, cast iron components, and zero electronics meant fewer failure points. And despite being worked to death in logging, farming, and construction, thousands of Highboys are still around. Collectors chase them today because they represent Ford at its toughest, uncompromising, overbuilt, and nearly impossible to kill. The Highboy was the last of Ford's brute force era, and it still carries that reputation. Toyota Hilux 1968 to 1995. The Toyota Hilux isn't just tough, it's practically unkillable. Top Gear drowned one, set it on fire, dropped it from a building, and it still ran. That wasn't a stunt. That was the Hilux being itself. Its secret was Toyota's obsession with durability. Engines like the 20R and 22R were small but massively overbuilt. Timing chains, thick castings, and oversized cooling systems meant these motors could hit 500,000 miles easily, sometimes even 1 million. The manual gearboxes were built like tanks, and the ladder frame was fully boxed for ultimate strength. What set the Hilux apart was its global reach. From African deserts to Australian outback, it became the vehicle of choice for aid workers, farmers, and even militaries. It could run on bad fuel, endure neglect, and still keep moving when everything else quit. Today, older Hiluxes are treasured. People won't sell them because nothing modern matches their reliability. The Hilux proved you don't need flash, You just need to be unstoppable. Chevrolet C10 1967 to 1972. The C10 wasn't the biggest, the flashiest, or the most powerful truck of its time. But ask anyone who's owned one, and they'll tell you it hit the sweet spot between practicality and toughness so perfectly that it still feels relevant today. Built in the late 60s and early 70s, the C10 had that clean, no-nonsense design. Thick steel panels, simple ladder frames, and suspension setups that could take decades of daily punishment. No airbags, no electronics, just coil springs up front and leafs in the rear that did their job without complaint. The engines were just as dependable. The straight-six 250 was practically unkillable, while the small block 350 V8 became one of the most loved truck engines of all time. These motors weren't working at their limit in the C10, which meant they lasted longer than anyone expected. Pair them with tough 3- and 4-speed manuals or the indestructible TH350 automatic, and you had a truck that didn't know the meaning of retirement. Owners loved how easy these trucks were to wrench on. The engine bays were roomy. The manuals actually showed you how to adjust valves and timing, and parts were everywhere. These trucks were designed for owners to fix themselves, not just hand over to dealerships. What makes the C10 remarkable is that thousands are still daily drivers. They're not just museum pieces or weekend cruisers. They're hauling, towing, and working, half a century after they left the factory. The C10 proved that sometimes the best design isn't the fanciest, it's the one that just works. And 50 years later, it still does. Jeep Gladiator. 1963 to 1987. Before the modern version, the original Jeep Gladiator was the real survivor. Built with a fully boxed ladder frame and rubber-mounted body panels, it was engineered for abuse. The AMC inline-six engines, especially the 232 and 258, were understressed and legendary for their long life. Paired with Dana axles, bulletproof transfer cases, and manual locking hubs, the Gladiator kept things purely mechanical. No fragile electronics. Its versatility was unmatched. Jeep sold it in multiple wheelbases and configurations, but every model carried the same tough DNA. That's why rural mail carriers, utility crews, and farmers all trusted Gladiators in the harshest conditions. They weren't fast or comfortable, but they were dependable. Many still see daily use, hauling on farms or crawling through rugged trails. Owners rarely sell them because once you've had a truck that reliable, you never let it go. The original Gladiator was pure function, built to last. GMC Sierra Grande. 1973 to 1987. If the Chevy square bodies were tough, the GMC Sierra Grande was their overachieving cousin, the one built to take an extra beating and still come back for more. GMC marketed itself as professional grade, and in the 70s and 80s, they weren't exaggerating. The Sierra Grande was proof. Unlike people think, these weren't just rebadged Chevys. GMC engineers went out of their way to beef up almost every component. Heavier duty suspensions, stronger rear axles, bigger radiators, and thicker wiring harnesses came standard. Even the alternators were uprated compared to Chevy models. These weren't cosmetic differences. They were real, mechanical upgrades designed for trucks that would see harder work. Under the hood, the Sierra Grande usually packed either a 350 or a 454 V8, both engines that were practically unkillable when maintained. The transmissions were equally bulletproof. While Chevrolets often ran the TH350 automatic, GMC trucks more often came with the TH400, the heavy-duty option used in larger commercial vehicles. Manual buyers got the SM4655 4-speed, a gearbox so stout it was also used in medium-duty trucks. What made the Sierra Grande special was how it aged. Rust prevention was better than most trucks of its era. Drain holes were smartly placed, undercoating was thicker, and seam sealing was more generous. In the Rust Belt, where salt devoured competitors, the Sierra Grande survived. These trucks weren't collector pieces back then. They were work rigs. Farmers, contractors, and tradesmen drove them into the ground, and yet, decades later, many are still hauling, still earning their keep. The Sierra Grande didn't need to be flashy because its entire job was to prove it could take punishment longer than anyone else's truck. And it did. Dodge Power Wagon. 1946 to 1968. Want to know what happens when you take a World War II military truck and sell it to the public? You get the Dodge Power Wagon, arguably the toughest civilian pickup ever built. This wasn't a truck designed with farmers in mind. It was designed to survive artillery, fire. Dodge just gave it a civilian paint job and handed it over. The Power Wagon's DNA was pure military. The frame was massive. The axles could handle far more than the truck would ever carry, and the cast iron transfer case was essentially indestructible. Even the body design was military. Flat panels, exposed bolts, no styling flourishes whatsoever. Everything was function over form, which meant everything was easy to repair with basic tools. The engine was a 230 cubic inch flathead 6. 94 horsepower sounds laughable today, but it wasn't about power. It was about reliability. Built to run on terrible wartime fuel and endure extreme conditions, this motor barely broke a sweat in civilian life. Owners routinely racked up 200,000 miles without major repairs, which was mind-blowing for the 1940s and 50s. And here's the kicker. Dodge barely changed the Power Wagon for 22 years. From 1946 to 1968, it was essentially the same truck, which meant parts interchangeability was off the charts. Your grandfather could fix it, and so could you. These trucks were favorites in logging camps, mining sites, and oil fields, places where failure wasn't an option. Even today, original Power Wagons are still out there working. They're slow, they ride rough, and they drink gas like crazy. But they simply refuse to die. In a world full of luxury truck pretenders, the Power Wagon remains the purest definition of unstoppable. Ford F-Series 1948 to 1952. Before the F-150 became America's default truck, Ford launched the first-generation F-Series in 1948. And let's be clear, this wasn't built as a lifestyle accessory. This was a tool designed for farmers, contractors, and small business owners who needed something that worked every single day without fail. The most famous engine option was the 239 cubic inch flathead V8. With about 100 horsepower, it wasn't setting any records. But here's the thing about flatheads. They were simple, almost primitive, and nearly impossible to kill. No overhead valves, no fancy valve trains, just pistons pumping up and down inside a block of iron. They could run on lousy fuel, tolerate neglect, and still fire up every morning. The transmissions were just as rugged. Most came with a 3-speed manual, no synchros, which meant you had to double clutch. But these boxes were carved out of solid steel. 70 years later, many still shift as if they rolled off the factory floor yesterday. Ford's construction philosophy was simple. Overbuild everything. Frames were thick ladder designs. Bodies were heavy-gauge steel. Even the running boards were tough enough to handle a grown man jumping on them daily. The electrical system was equally basic. 6 volts, a generator, mechanical voltage regulators. No electronics, no sensors, no headaches. These weren't pampered weekend toys. They hauled lumber, plowed fields, and lived brutal working lives, and yet, thousands survive today, not as shiny museum pieces, but as trucks still hauling on farms and ranches. That's the legacy of the first-generation F-Series. A truck so simple and so durable that it's still doing what it was built to do nearly 75 years later. Chevrolet K, 5 Blazer, 1973 to 1991. Technically an SUV, but let's not split hairs. The K5 Blazer was basically a pickup in disguise, and it was every bit as tough as its truck cousins. Built on GM's legendary square body platform, the K5 earned a reputation for being unkillable, and the proof is that you still see them everywhere. The K5's secret weapon was its shared DNA with Chevy and GMC pickups. That meant it was built on an over-engineered foundation, and that parts were literally everywhere. Junkyards were full of them. Mechanics knew them inside and out. If something broke, you could swap it in minutes. Under the hood, the 350 small block V8 became the go-to engine. Simple, reliable, and still in production decades later, it could easily clear 300,000 miles with nothing more than regular oil changes. The transmission lineup was just as bulletproof. The TH350 and TH400 automatics were workhorses, and the SM465 manual was so overbuilt that it's still used in heavy-duty applications today. The Blazer's design made it easy to keep alive, too. Straight lines and bolt-on panels meant body repairs were simple. Doors unbolted, fenders swapped easily, and even rust was manageable thanks to uncomplicated shapes. Unlike modern vehicles, you didn't need a computer and thousands of dollars in diagnostic gear. A wrench and a Saturday afternoon were enough. GM kept the K5's basic design nearly unchanged for 18 years, which meant incredible parts interchangeability. Need a door for your 88? Grab one from a 75. It'll fit. That's unheard of today. What's amazing is how many K5s are still daily drivers. They're not just collector rigs or weekend toys. They're still hauling, still pulling, still working. In a world where modern SUVs barely last a decade before hitting the junkyard, the K5 Blazer is proof that simple, tough, and repairable is the winning formula. International Harvester Scout, 1961 to 1980. The Scout wasn't pretty. It wasn't comfortable, and it definitely wasn't built for luxury. But if you wanted a truck that could outlive you, your kids, and probably your grandkids, this boxy beast from International Harvester was the one. International didn't come from the car world. They built tractors and commercial trucks, so when they designed the Scout, they approached it with the same philosophy: overbuild everything. Thick steel body, massive frame, farm equipment grade axles, and transfer cases that seemed to laugh at the idea of failure. Even the door hinges were stronger than most competitors' frames. The engines told the same story. The legendary 345 cubic inch V8, originally designed for medium-duty trucks and tractors, found its way under the Scout's hood. It wasn't fast and it wasn't efficient, but it would run forever. Some owners clocked 500,000 miles on the original block without ever pulling it apart. Try that with a modern engine. What made the Scout so beloved was its simplicity. No computers, no fragile electronics, just mechanical parts that could be fixed with a wrench and a little know-how. And because International shared parts across their lineup, replacements were cheap and easy to find. Here's the kicker. When other manufacturers started downsizing in the 70s, adding complexity to meet new emissions rules, International refused to play along. They just kept building the Scout the same way: thick, heavy, and unbreakable. That stubbornness is exactly why these trucks survive today. If you're lucky enough to find one now, chances are the owner won't sell. Because once you've lived with a Scout, you realize it's not just a truck. It's a partner that outlasts everything else. Nissan Hardbody D21, 1986 to 1997. If you spent time in the American Southwest in the late 80s or 90s, chances are you saw one of these, usually with faded paint, a dented bed, and 300,000 miles on the odometer. The Nissan Hardbody D21 didn't get its nickname from marketing. It earned it the hard way, by refusing to brake. The design was straightforward. A simple ladder frame, leaf springs in the back, torsion bars up front. Nothing exotic, nothing fragile. The Hardbody's compact size made it nimble, but the build quality made it legendary. Rust resistance was better than most competitors, especially in desert climates where these trucks are still running strong. The engines were bulletproof 4-cylinders, particularly the KA24E, understressed, torquey enough for real work, and capable of outlasting owners who didn't bother with maintenance. Pair that with 5-speed manual gearboxes that felt indestructible, and you had a recipe for a truck that seemed allergic to failure. These trucks weren't just popular with commuters. They became favorites among landscapers, delivery drivers, and small businesses because they were cheap to run and impossible to kill. Internationally, they were just as respected, finding use in rugged conditions where breakdowns weren't an option. The Hardbody's styling even matched its reputation: sharp edges, squared-off lines, and that unmistakable tough stance. It looked like a truck that meant business, and it delivered exactly that. Decades later, thousands of D21s are still daily drivers. They might not have air-conditioned leather seats or touchscreens, but they'll start every morning and get you home every night. And that's why the Hardbody belongs on this list. It wasn't flashy, but it was eternal. Datsun 620, pickup 1972 to 1979. Before Nissan became a household name in America, there was Datsun, and the 620 pickup was the little truck that could. While the big three were focused on massive, thirsty V8s, Datsun slipped into the market with a compact, affordable truck that was simple, efficient, and most importantly, nearly indestructible. The 620 was powered by small inline-fours like the L16 and L20B. Modest power, yes, but the engineering was rock solid. These engines could take abuse, bad fuel, and neglected oil changes, and still keep running. Many of these trucks racked up hundreds of thousands of miles in the hands of owners who barely knew what maintenance meant. The design philosophy was equally practical. Sturdy ladder frames, leaf spring rears, and a no-frills interior meant there was very little to break in the first place. The 620 didn't need to impress. It just needed to work, and it did. But here's where it gets interesting. The Datsun 620 was one of the first compact pickups to really take off in America. Suddenly, buyers realized they didn't need a massive gas guzzler to haul light loads or commute to work. These trucks fit in tight city streets, sipped fuel, and outlasted vehicles twice their size. Even more impressive, they started a reputation that would carry forward into Nissan's future Hardbody and Frontier lines. The 620 laid the groundwork for Nissan's image as a maker of small trucks that simply don't quit. Today, finding a clean 620 is tough, not because they broke down, but because people drove them until there was nothing left. That's the ultimate compliment for a truck. It wasn't just owned, it was used up after decades of loyal service. So there you have it, 12 pickups that refused to play by modern rules of planned obsolescence. These trucks weren't built for comfort or style. They were built to survive decades of abuse, outliving trends, owners, and sometimes even entire companies. But here's the real question. Which one do you think deserves the crown as the toughest of all time? Drop your stories in the comments, hit subscribe, and let's see whose truck outlasts the rest.